Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 235 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. What does early America look like if we view it through Native American eyes? Jenny Hale Pulsipher, an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University, is a scholar who enjoys investigating the many answers to this question. And today, she joins us to share one Native American perspective on a critical time in the early American past, the period between the 1650s and the 1680s. Now, the mid to late 17th century was a time of great transformation in power and governance. King Philip's War, that war that took place between 1675 and 1678, devastated Native American populations within New England and led to a great decline in Native power and standing within that region. Plus, London officials challenged the power of the colonists. In 1684, the English crown revoked the Massachusetts Bay Charter, and in 1686, it united Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey into a single administrative union known as the Dominion of New England. So this was a really volatile time in early America, which should make us wonder, how did Native Americans view and experience this period? Well, Jenny has a perspective she'd like to share with us. It's the story of John Wampus, a Nipmuc Indian whose life can not only illuminate this really fascinating period of early American history, but who can also show us what was possible for Native Americans in 17th century America. Now, as we explore and investigate the life of John Wampus, Jenny reveals who John Wampus was and details about the interesting life he led, the ways in which John Wampus navigated both the native and English worlds of 17th century England and New England, and why it's important for us to explore early America through Native American perspectives. But first, I'll be in Albany, New York this Thursday, April 25, to give a free public program called A Visit to Ben Franklin's World. The talk will take place at the New York State Cultural Education Center, and we'll meet up with each other at the pre-talk reception at 5 p.m. Now, I've placed a link to all the details about this fun event in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. And next week, I'll be in Milwaukee, where we'll meet up on Monday, April 29 at 6 p.m. at Zafiro's Pizza. And on Tuesday, April 30th, I'll be participating in another free public program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee called Podcasting the Past, an evening with Ben Franklin's World. To RSVP for these Wisconsin events, visit benfranklinsworld.com/meetup. Okay, are you ready to meet Jenny Hale Pulsipher and John Wampus? Allow me to introduce you. Joining us is an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University. She's written numerous articles, including 2 for the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943, plus 2 books, including Subjects Unto the Same King, Indians, English, and the Contest for Authority in Colonial New England, and, most recently, Swindler Sachem, the American Indian who sold his birthright, dropped out of Harvard, and conned the King of England. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jenny Hale Pulsipher.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
I really think we need to start with the title of your book, Jenny, because, wow, that's a great book title. It's very descriptive. So, how did you come up with the title for your book? And could you tell us something about the Swindler Sachem, John Wampus, who, as you said in your title, sold his birthright, dropped out of Harvard, and somehow managed to con the King of England?
Sure. The short answer is I asked my son, John, who is not a historian, to read the book and tell me what he thought might be a good, engaging, descriptive title. My editor thought the titles that I had come up with myself were boring, but he loved John's title. The long answer is, and this is the reason I decided to go with John's suggestion, is that the title does some important work. First off, it provides a partial list of the unusual things John Wampus did in his life, things we don't usually associate with Native people in colonial America. learning that someone did do these and many other things forces us to change our understanding of what was possible for Native people at this time. Second, the title is intentionally provocative. It's possible that some people might assume it reflects a European perspective, that I'm profiling a Native man who cheated Europeans. John Wampus did cheat Europeans. He intentionally sold land to them that he knew other Europeans already held title to. But the title Swindler Sachem is intended to represent a Native perspective. John Wampus also cheated his fellow Nipmucs, selling Native land without their knowledge or permission. And to do that, he claimed the status of Sachem. That was a cheat too, because none of his kin acknowledged him as a Sachem. In a very real sense, the title is also a reflection of John Wampus's personal style, which was boldly provocative. He frequently made claims that were partly true and partly false. Readers will find as they get deeper into the book that I unpack the half-truths of the title. For instance, John Wampus was and was not a swindler and a Sachem. He betrayed his people, but he also sought to protect them. I hope that readers of this book will see John Wampus as a man who successfully navigated a really challenging time of political transition and diminishing Native sovereignty, using all the tools available to him in both cultures. People who do that kind of negotiating are often distrusted. They're seen as swindlers by both sides. But the truth is often much more complicated and more interesting.
You mentioned that some might perceive your title as trying to convey the story of John Wampus's life from a European perspective, but really your intent is to try and portray his life through a Native point of view. And I happen to think this is a really important point because a lot of scholars talk about the challenge of trying to get at aspects of Native American history from a Native American point of view. So would you be able to tell us why scholars encounter so many challenges when it comes to relating the past through Native viewpoints and how scholars like yourself are able to meet and overcome these challenges?
It is a challenge because we've heard the old saying many times that winners get to write the history. And the winners in this case, from a 21st century perspective, were the colonists and, the Europeans who conquered North America. They are the people who accumulated a lot of wealth and a lot of power. And when you have those things, you're able to preserve your records. People hand down letters and memoirs and various other kinds of documents, and your story gets told. For the Native people who lost their land, lost their wealth, and sometimes those family lines stopped as well. John Wampus didn't have any living children. There was no one to preserve that record if there had been one made, and they didn't have people passing them down and institutions preserving those records. So we're stuck having to read a lot of Native history through the writings of the Europeans whose writings have been preserved. And of course, there's an inherent bias in that perspective. That means that we have to be really careful reading between the lines to try to get at the Native perspective. We can find the Native perspective in court cases and in other kinds of places where their voice might be heard, even if it's being reported by European people. And there's also other ways to get at it through looking at the archaeological record, looking at the oral histories, stories that have been passed down by descendants of those Native people, talking with modern day descendants and trying to figure it out that way. One of the most interesting ways, I think, to get at the Native perspective, and this is a way that a lot of recent historians working with Native American methodologies are using, is to look more closely at Native language, seeing the kinds of words they used, even the kinds of pronunciations that different dialects might have used, to give us some insight into the way that Native people would have perceived the world around them.
Now, I think it's time that we dig into the specific story of John Wampus for a bit. We know that by the age of 14, Wampus was an orphan. Jenny, do we know how he became an orphan or anything else about his childhood?
He was, as you said, orphaned. His mother died in 1647 when he was probably, around 7 years old. His father died in 1651, so he was just a little older than that. Now, sometime between the death of his mother and the death of his father, whose name was Wampus, went to see John Eliot, who was a minister who was very heavily involved in preaching the Christian gospel to the Native people. And Wampus and his wife had both become Christians. They had learned about and decided to be baptized in the Christian religion. And they were quite ardent converts. And Wampus went to John Eliot and said, I would like to have my son and some other Nipmuc boys that he had with him live with an English family, learn to speak English, learn the Christian religion. At the time, John Eliot said, I think he's a little young. Why don't you keep him home? But after John Wampus's mother died, John did go to live with Isaac Heath, a friend of John Eliot who lived in Roxbury. So he's living in Roxbury in the home of Isaac and Elizabeth Heath. And the purpose of having them live in that home is to experience the same kind of upbringing that English children might have experienced, in the sense that parents were expected to have regular kind of devotional periods with their children and with their servants, reading from the Bible, talking about doctrine, ensuring that they went to worship services, those kinds of things. So John would have experienced that kind of religious training in home, as well as educational training, learning how to read and how to speak English before he would have even started school in the regular school building.
So it sounds like even from the start of his life, John Wampus had quite an unusual life. He was a Nipmuc Indian who was raised as an English boy rather than a Nipmuc boy. Or perhaps, maybe I'm mistaken, and it wasn't unusual at all for a Native American child in the 17th century to be raised with a more English upbringing, because when you think about 17th century Massachusetts, we know that Native Americans and English colonists really did live fairly close together and side by side.
There's a little bit of both. Roxbury was a town that had quite a number of Native youth living in it. Some of them were slaves, people who had been captured in the Pequot War and then had been sold into English families to help with, domestic labor. So there were a number of those living in Roxbury, but there were also a number of youth who had been sent there specifically with the goal of receiving that English education. And so John would have attended school with English children, but also with some Native children. John Eliot was working closely with what later became called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, which was intended to teach Native people about the Christian gospel. One of the goals that they had was to create a Native ministry. So Native people who had gone through kind of the same series of steps to become a minister as an English person might go through. And the first step was to go to a grammar school. Grammar school was called that because you learned not just English grammar, but Latin and Greek grammar in preparation for meeting the requirements for entering Harvard College, or, in England, it would have been a different college, of course.
So did John go through these steps? Did he attend the English grammar school and do well enough to attend Harvard?
He did. He first went to Roxbury Grammar School and started learning there. Eventually, the commissioners in the colonies who worked with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel wrote to the people involved in the education and said, let's move kind of the most promising youth in the Roxbury Grammar School up to the Cambridge Grammar School, because the teacher there was known to be really talented in teaching people Greek and Latin. So John gets moved to Cambridge Grammar School and is there for a couple of years. And then in about 1664, 1665, he begins school at Harvard. So he had to meet the same requirements as young English students would have had to, being able to read, write, and speak in Latin and Greek, as well as some other requirements.
So really, by any standard we would have used in this period, or even our own period, John Wampus was a really highly educated young man. And it also sounds like his whole life was kind of prescribed and laid out for him, too. Like the SPG and John Eliot were making these decisions about his life. So do we know how he felt about attending these English schools and studying for the ministry?
It's very interesting to try to get at how John Wampus felt about it. How I wish he'd left a diary or written some letters, but unfortunately he didn't. However, I did come across a very interesting document that helped me get some insight into how he felt about it. And this is a copy of a Latin text. It's Cicero's De Officiis, and it belonged to John Wompas. We know that because on the title page it says John Wampus, his book, 1665. And in addition to that kind of claiming of the book, John did some interesting doodling in the book. He sketched some pictures. He also did some doodling in Latin, where he wrote out some phrases. And initially, I was most interested in the picture. For instance, he has a picture facing the title page that is clearly a rough sketch of the Cambridge Meeting House. The Meeting House is where church was held in Cambridge, and it was right next to Harvard College. So that's where the Harvard students, including the native students, would have gone for their worship services. So he draws this picture of the meeting house, and then he writes in it, John Savage, his meeting house, the king of it, I say. It's a kind of tongue-in-cheek phrase, I think, where he's mocking basically his own status there as someone who is studying to become the king of the meeting house, or in other words, a minister. It seems to have kind of a mocking tone to it. And I wondered about that. And then later I thought, I wonder what those Latin words that he scribbled in the front of the book might mean. And so I got a friend who's a classical scholar to help me with the translation. And it turns out that one of the things he doodled in his book is, I cherish a desire to be at sea, which is a really interesting thing to read in John Wampus's book, because he does not stay at Harvard and graduate from Harvard. Instead, after a couple of years, in about 1668, he drops out and becomes a sailor. He may have been one of the only sailors in the Atlantic world who could read, write, and speak Latin and Greek, and probably a smattering of Chaldean and Hebrew. So it was pretty unusual for someone with that kind of education to become an ordinary sailor. When he dropped out, Daniel Gookin wrote in a letter to the people in charge of the corporation for the propagation of the gospel, he wrote to them that one of the native youth decided to go to sea, which he preferred to remaining and studying for the ministry. So clearly, John Wompas, in his writing and in his illustration, he's kind of mocking the idea of becoming a minister. He's saying explicitly that he wanted to go to sea. And when I looked at that phrase, I found something else really interesting as well. This was kind of my favorite archival experience, you might say, during writing this book. And that is, I have a picture of this page in the book. The phrase, I cherish a desire to be at sea, is, of course, in Latin, but there's some interesting scribbling around it. Underneath that phrase, it says something scribbled out, but you can tell underneath it, it says John Wampus. And then under that, it says, is a fool for writing, I cherish a desire to be at sea. And then that John Wampus is scratched out and written in its place. It says, Joseph Brown is a fool for writing, I cherish a desire to be at sea. So I thought, what is going on here? There's clearly some kind of drama taking place with the people reading and writing on this book. And as I did a little research to figure out who Joseph Brown was, I realized that he was John Wampus's tutor. The tutors at Harvard were older students who had completed their undergraduate degrees and were beginning their graduate study, who would stay on and work very closely with the younger students. Basically, they would take a set of students in hand and be the person who that student would give their recitations to, who they would show their work to. So they worked very closely together. Joseph Brown is John Wampus's tutor. And I imagined that what must have happened on this particular day was Joseph Brown is walking around the classroom, kind of seeing how the students are doing, and he notices that John Wampus is doodling in his book, that he's writing this phrase, which translated says, I cherish a desire to be at sea. Now, Joseph Brown either thought that John Wampus had written it incorrectly because he changes the spelling of one of the words, or that he thought that it was just a silly thing for Wampus to express that sentiment. Why would anyone want to go to sea rather than stay at Harvard? So he writes underneath it, John Wampus is a fool for writing the phrase, And then he moves on. And John Wompas, who's probably angry because of this rebuke, scribbles out his own name and writes, Joseph Brown is a fool. And then for writing that phrase. And so he's, kind of showing his anger and his frustration at being at Harvard. And easy to understand how it would have been a frustrating experience for him. For one thing, John Wampus enters Harvard when he's in his mid-20s. So he's quite a bit older than the other students who are mostly teenagers. He's probably older than his tutor. And so it's hard to be in a position of getting reprimanded and having to live with a bunch of teenage boys when you are an adult man who's actually married. It would have been an awkward position.
Yes. And I definitely want us to talk about John Wampus's marriage to Anne Prask. But before we explore his marriage, I'd like to go back to a question you raised, which is, what were the limits and opportunities for a man like Wampus? So in terms of occupational opportunities, what was Wampus's life like at sea, and what would his life have been like if he had finished his training and become a Native American minister?
Well, traditionally, we associate going to sea with freedom. That's the one thing that it would have offered him. He would no longer have been under the really kind of rigid hierarchical structure of education at Harvard. He would also not have been under the expectations of becoming a minister, which he clearly didn't want to do. But in terms of other opportunities, if he had stuck with the life of a sailor, he possibly could have eventually risen in the ranks and become, a captain, for instance. Nancy Shoemaker's recent book on Native men in the maritime trades suggests that that was a possibility for Native as well as European men. But in order to follow that career path, you had to really stick with it. And it was very helpful if you were from a family that was also involved in the maritime trade. And John Wampus didn't have a family that was in the sailors trade, and he also didn't really stick with it. He would go to sea when it suited him. And then at other times, he would remain on land for a good deal of time and try selling land to make his income. So by taking kind of a whenever he wanted to approach to the sailor's trade, he ensured that he stayed in the bottom ranks pretty much the whole time.
And now back to that really interesting fact that you mentioned earlier, which is John Wampus attended Harvard as a married man. What can you tell us about his marriage and about his wife, Anne Prask?
Anne was also a Native person. She was not Nipmuc like John. She was probably Mohican from what's now the New York area. She had been living in a place called Sasqua, which is now Fairfield, Connecticut, in the late 1630s at the time of the Pequot War. And during the Pequot War, Pequot Indians fleeing the Mystic Fort massacre sought refuge with the Sasqua Indians, who were probably in subjection to them. And so they all went into a swamp together to basically try to defend themselves against the English, who were chasing them across what's now Connecticut to try to capture the fleeing Pequots. The English arrived and they surrounded the swamp and took everyone prisoner. A few Native soldiers escaped, including Anne's father, a man named Romanoc. But Anne was left in the swamp, and she was among the about 200 Native people who were taken prisoner. Because they were captured by the English and because they had given shelter to the Pequots, the English said that basically they had forfeited their lives and they could be either executed or made into slaves. That was kind of the doctrine of war, of just war at the time. So she gets sold into slavery. She's taken back to Massachusetts, and she is either purchased or given to Joshua Hughes, who's a prominent resident in the town of Roxbury. So she's living in Roxbury as a very young girl. She's maybe 5 years old, maybe a little older at this time. And she grows up there at the same time that John Wampus is growing up. In fact, they're in homes that you can see one from the other near the green in Roxbury. So they would have attended the same church together. It's possible that Anne Prask also attended some school for a time. One of the records mentions a girl attending school, and she's able to write her initial. She writes a very graceful A on a deed. And so it looks like she may have had some instruction. So it's very likely that they met there in Roxbury, and then they later marry in 1661.
You mentioned that John sold land when he wasn't out at sea. Since Anne brought land into their marriage, is this the land that John Wampus sold? And if so, how would he have helped Anne sell it?
That's a really interesting story. Anne's father, Romanoc, the one who escaped from the swamp fight, later returns to the Sasquatch area. And quite soon after the Pequot War, English people start settling in that area. Well, Romanoc is, according to a number of documents, mostly associated with John Wampus, a sachem, and he owns a considerable amount of land there in Sasquatch and Aspetuck. In about the year 1658, Romanoc writes a deed in which he gives his land there to his daughter Prask. About 6 months after he writes that deed, John Wampus and Anne Prask get married. When you look at the circumstances surrounding the deed, which are later testified to in a court case where the English residents of Fairfield are challenging the claims of John Wampus's heirs to this land, they say that John Wampus had been present when Romanoc deeded this land over to Prask, and that he had actually gone through this quite complicated series of actions in order to ensure that the transfer of land was recognized by English law. So, for instance, he recruits Thomas Minor, who lives in Connecticut, to be a witness to the deed. He arranges for Romanoc to go through a turf and twig ceremony. This is a really archaic English ceremony where you cut a little bit of turf out of the ground and put a stick in it, and the person who's selling it gives it to the person who's buying it. So it's this very visual representation of the transfer of land. And he makes sure that the deed gets registered in legal courts. He also makes sure that people know that Romanoc is a sachem, because in native law, the right to convey land was held by the sachem. So he's making sure that it's going to be legitimate in both English and Indian law. So he's going through all of these hoops to make sure that this land gets conveyed legally. And then, as I said before, just about 6 months later, he marries Anne Prask. Now, he marries her in an English court. An English magistrate marries them. It's not a native ceremony. And this, again, has some pretty significant legal ramifications under English law, which included coverture. It was the idea that a woman's legal and political identity were subsumed or covered in the identity of her husband or her father. And so when a woman married a man, if she brought any property into the marriage with her, that property became legally the property of her husband. So when John Wampus marries Anne Prask, all that land that Romanoc has conveyed to Prask becomes John Wampus's land, and he immediately starts selling it. And it seems clear that some of the money that he gets from those land sales is what he uses to purchase a house on Boston Common. So he and Anne Prask live in a house that's on the edge of Boston Common. It's the only house owned by a native person in Boston during the 17th century, and they live there. They're living a very unusual life for Indian people in this time period.
This is really fascinating because we talked about John's education in the English grammar school and at Harvard, and he clearly picked up a lot of different knowledge about Native American and English legal and cultural customs. And then, of course, he seems to have used this knowledge to acquire and sell Anne's land, to buy a house, and to secure future titles to land, too.
Yes. It seems to be something that he starts very early. This transaction with Romanoc's land is the first one. But soon after that, there's evidence that John Wampus is perhaps advising other native people on selling their land. His name appears as a witness on a couple of land transactions in Massachusetts. And then later he starts selling land that he himself claims in Nipmuc country to various English people.
And that's a really interesting development, too, because in 1674, Massachusetts placed a prohibition on John Wampus selling Native American lands. So after we talk about our episode sponsor for a moment, we should definitely take a look at how John managed to get around this prohibition to sell the different Nipmuc and native lands that he claimed. What do you think it would have been like to be someone like John Wampus? someone who was raised and educated outside of their native culture, I think it must have been both incredibly fascinating and incredibly frustrating at times. This is a really interesting thought for us to consider, though, because it's a thought that can help us explore and learn more about the early American past. And learning, after all, is something that we love to do. You know, I don't know about you, but I developed my sense of curiosity very early on. I mean, as soon as my parents taught me to read, my nose was in a book. And if it wasn't in a book, then I was working on the pipeworks, erector sets, and science kits that they gave my brother and me. And I'm really glad they taught us to read and gave us these interesting kits, because I don't think it's ever really too early to encourage a love of learning. Which is exactly why I'm telling all my friends with kids to check out KiwiCo. They create these super cool hands-on projects that make STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, so much fun. In fact, I was talking with Kelly, who's our master of schedules and so much more at the Omohundro Institute, and I found out that she subscribes to KiwiCo for her 6-year-old son. She says her son loves getting his own mail each month, and that the kits are a really great way for them to spend time together. Plus, the skill level of each kit is pitched just right. Not too easy, but not so hard that they become a source of frustration. Kelly is such an enthusiast about KiwiCo that I ordered kits for my young niece and nephew, and I can't wait to try them out with them. I'm a real supporter of any toy that makes it easy for parents, or proud aunts and uncles like me and my partner Tim, to have a fun time and also build a sense of creativity and confidence in their kids. And with a KiwiCo subscription, you get a monthly chance to do just that. KiwiCo kits are available for kids ages 0 through 16, and each one arrives right on your doorstep, fully complete. So no hunting for supplies or mid-project trips to the hardware or craft store. And you can cancel or pause your delivery at any time. So why not share your love of learning with the kids in your life by taking advantage of this special offer for Ben Franklin's World listeners? Visit kiwico.com/bfworld and get your first crate free. That's kiwico.com/bfworld for your first crate free. kiwico.com/bfworld. KiwiCo. They make learning enjoyable for all kids with strategized and accessible learning projects. Jenny, how did John Wampus get around Massachusetts' 1674 prohibition against selling native lands? Did he sell most of the Nipmuc and other native lands that he claimed and advised on before this prohibition? Or did he sell them all after the prohibition?
Both. Again, he's making his money by selling land and then occasionally by going on trips as a sailor. And he is determined to keep on doing this, but his kin are very much opposed to him selling native land. John Wampus is using this for his own profit, and he is not doing one of the important steps that was necessary in conveying native land under native understanding, and that was to get the permission of the traditional users of the land and for the Sachem or Sachem to convey that land. The Sachem was the one who had the permission to do it, the legal right. So John Wampus just kind of jumps over that step. There's an interesting case where he's selling land to a man who's also a sailor, one of his friends. And he sells him land, and in the deed itself, he claims that he has the right to 14 square miles of land, basically, as his legal and lawful inheritance. Well, later on, when the deed gets registered, a little line is written above that. It says, or 1/3 part thereof. It's as if the clerk who's recording this deed says, now, wait a minute, this isn't all your land, is it? Aren't there other native people who have claim to this land? And in fact, he has 2 uncles who have just as much right to the land as he does. He must say, well, yeah, I guess so, when he writes in, or 1/3 part thereof, thereby acknowledging that, yes, in fact, there are other native people who claim it, but he doesn't get their permission. So he's trying to kind of get around that. His kin object. They find out that he's selling the land. They see that he's doing it for his own profit, and they complain to the Massachusetts government. And then the Massachusetts government bans him from selling any further land. And at that point, he can try to keep making deals under the table, or he can try to overcome that ban. And he decides that he's going to try to overcome it. That's when he makes the decision to go to England and appeal to the king.
Yeah, would you tell us about Wampus's first known trip to England? He made that trip in 1674, and as you said, he went to overcome the Massachusetts ban on selling native land. So, how exactly did Wampus go about trying to overcome this colonial law?
Really interesting, again, to see how he goes about that process. He has the goal of seeing the king as his primary purpose in doing this trip. And you can tell that because I came across some references to John preparing for his trip in 1674. He takes some work. He goes to work for a merchant named Robert Gibbs in Massachusetts, and he uses his earnings to purchase white and black cloth. Now, in formal wear in Massachusetts, white and black was what you would wear. That's why we get the stereotype of the Puritan wearing black and white, because in formal portraits, yes, that's what they wore when they went to church. So he gets some quite nice black cloth and white cloth for a shirt, gets a suit made, gets kind of an outer covering. And next thing we know, he's in England and trying to get an audience with the king. Now, that didn't turn out to be quite as easy a thing as he had hoped. He ends up staying in England for several years. We don't know exactly how he goes about trying to get into the king, but we do know that at this particular time, the king had severely limited access to his person. He felt like he was not being treated adequate respect by Parliament, which was ignoring some of his edicts. And so he basically says, people who support me can come and see me, but closed the doors to the kind of easy access that had been the case earlier than that. So it's possible that John Wampus showed up at Whitehall, the palace of the king in England, and tried to get access and was just turned away, and that they didn't know about him. Well, eventually he runs out of money. His wages probably run out. He's living kind of large, which is standard practice for John Wampus, kind of treating people to hospitality, to drinks. And he ends up in debtor's prison for a small debt, actually, but even a small debt could get you into debtor's prison. So he's stuck in prison. And while he's there, he writes a petition to the king. Now, he probably doesn't write it himself. It doesn't seem to be written in his hand. And the more typical way to get a petition to the king at this time would be to hire a scribe who understood the protocol for writing a petition. They would write it at your dictation, and then it would be delivered to the proper person at Whitehall to then get it to the king and his privy council. So he does send a petition to the king, and the king receives the petition. There's a record in the National Archives of them reading that petition in August of 1676, and then later the king actually responds to it. But John's still in prison. He's not able to get that letter or to get any benefit from it because he's still stuck with his debt. So he ends up selling land again, promising land to various sailors or tradesmen in the maritime neighborhoods of London who he has met, who agree to put the funds forward to get him out of his debt and out of prison. And he's able to get out and then eventually make his way to the crown. The way that he's able to get that final audience is kind of a lucky accident. The crown has demanded that Massachusetts send agents who are authorized to negotiate with the crown to answer for some of the failures to follow English law that have been reported in Massachusetts. So these agents arrive in London and they bring with them a couple of Nipmuc boys, Indian youth who've been captured in King Philip's War, which is going on in the colonies at this time. And clearly the purpose in bringing those boys is to try to answer to some complaints that have been made to the crown. Various people who are interested in overthrowing Massachusetts colonial authority have been telling the crown things like that they're abusing the Indians, that they're disobeying English law. So these agents bring these boys in new clothes, all kind of spruced up as evidence that, in fact, they are treating the native people well. These boys can't speak English. And John Wampus, of course, can speak English and can speak Nipmuc. They encounter each other probably at the Royal Exchange, which is where everybody went when they wanted to find someone from New England in London. And they end up taking John Wampus along with them to visit the king in December of 1676. So that's how he finally gets his audience with the king. And when he's finished with that audience, he's able to take his letter that the king has already written for him and go back home.
Wow. John Wampus got to meet Charles II, who granted him a letter to sell native lands that he claimed against the Massachusetts prohibition. Wow, just talk about beating the odds. So what happened to Wampus once he returned to Massachusetts with this letter in hand?
In 1677, he comes home. He's got the king's letter in his hand, and he must be feeling pretty good that he has this letter, which basically says, "Do justice to my subject, John Wampus." So the king has acknowledged him as his loyal subject. And I'm sure he is absolutely confident that he's going to get the right to sell land again. So he lands in Boston. One of the first things he does is go to John Leverett's house. John Leverett is the governor of the colony at that time, and he shows him the letter. And he probably expects that Leverett's going to say, "Oh, okay, if the king says so, I guess you can sell land." But that's not what happens. Instead, Leverett looks at it and says he will consider it and that he will send John Wampus to the Indian court for a hearing. Now, there were kind of two parallel court systems in Massachusetts at the time. There was the regular English court system, and then among the Christian Indian population, a separate Indian court system had been set up, which was staffed mostly by native people, but also had the supervision of a Massachusetts English magistrate. Now, John Wampus had been a resident of the town of Boston, and he had appeared in the English court system before, almost as if he were an English person. No one even comments on the fact that he's Indian, and he goes through that regular court system. But now, in the aftermath of King Philip's War, where there are far fewer native people in the colony, Wampus seems to have lost the ability to operate freely in both worlds. Instead of being referred to the English court system as a resident of Boston, he gets referred to the Indian court system. And he goes there, and there his relatives who've already complained against him for fraudulently selling their land are there at the hearing. And so is Daniel Gookin, the English magistrate, who has had legal run-ins with John Wampus in the past and doesn't have a very high opinion of him. So at this court hearing, everyone testifies against him and says he does not have the right to sell land. He is not a sachem. He has been abusing them through his land sales. They complain against him and say that he is someone who sells land in order to get money, to be drunk, and to waste it on his lusts. So they're really complaining against him. And he does not get that right to sell land back. So after all that effort, it has done him no good.
Now, in Swindler Sachem, you make the case that Wampus's actions and words between June 1677 and the summer of 1678 really demonstrate that Wampus had begun to embrace his Indian identity, as well as to sympathize with native grievances and antipathy for the English. Was it this experience in Indian court and this post-King Philip's War world that pushed Wampus to embrace his Indian identity?
I think it is. It must have just been a shock to him to come back to Massachusetts and find basically the world turned upside down. He expected to be able to return home in triumph with the king's letter in his hand. And what he finds instead is a series of real shocks. The first one is that he gets off the boat and goes to his house, this house on Boston Common, and finds that his wife Anne is not there. In fact, she's died. She had died the previous September. She got scalded and then developed an infection and died. And instead, there's an English family living in his house. Now, he knows these English people. They're the Hughes children that Anne had helped to raise in Roxbury. She leaves the house to them in a will that she writes before she dies. So that's shock number one. Then he gets another shock when he finds out that Leverett is not going to give him the right to sell his land. Another shock is the fact that his people have been decimated by King Philip's War. It's very hard on the native people of Massachusetts. At least 3,000 of them die or go into exile during the war. The population is significantly reduced, and a number of Nipmuc people are among those who have been killed during the war, including their sachem, Thomas Wittiscompenham. So they've lost their standing in the colony. Those native people who are still remaining are being restricted to essentially reservations. A select number of Christian Indian towns become places where Indians are allowed to live, and they are banned from living in Boston and in the other towns in the colony. So John Wampus, even if he was able to move into the house, which is now occupied by the English, probably couldn't stay there because of the nature of the restrictions that are in place. So all of these kind of blows to John Wampus have occurred in a very short space of time. Then he goes to the Indian court and receives their ruling. There are a number of court cases that take place around this time that mention John Wampus, and it's clear that he is hurting and angry in the aftermath of these changes. He goes to visit some English people in the town of what's now Newton, but at the time it was called Cambridge Village. And he complains about the way that the English are fighting against the Indians, about them going out of their jurisdiction. He makes fun of them. He says they're like greenhorns in their ability to fight the war. He claims that he's a loyal subject of the crown and that they aren't. The next day, he does the same thing. He gives a big speech in front of the English people of Cambridge and again says they are not loyal subjects to the crown, but he is. And he also kind of seems to threaten them. He says, in response to their staring at him, he says, "Have you never seen an Indian before?" And a couple of them say, "Well, yeah, of course." And he says, "And you shall feel them too," which sounds like he's saying, the Indians are going to attack and I know about it. So he's being very threatening and clearly showing his anger. English people complain that he's been going all around the colony complaining and saying that the English have been wronging them about their lands. So this is clearly related to their restriction on his sales, but it also may be that he's noticed how much native land has gone into English hands at very, very low prices, and that this is wronging them. So previously, he seemed to be very much focused on his own interests, on making his money, satisfying his own needs. But now in the change that's come after King Philip's War, he does seem to be concerned about not just himself, but about the impact of the war on his kin, on his friends. And he actually even seems to be trying to fill the shoes, perhaps, of the sachem who has died. In native society, sachems, it was an office that they usually inherited, but they also had to be received by acclamation of the native people. So they had to have certain qualities in order to be recognized by other people as a sachem. And those qualities would include things like generosity, being willing to share your wealth with others, and also courage. And one way to display that was through publicly insulting an enemy. Well, John Wampus is doing those things at this time period. He is treating other native people to drinks. For instance, he brings a whole barrel of cider to Natick and 15 or 16 people partake and get drunk and it becomes a court case. He also is publicly insulting the English, calling them greenhorns, telling them they're not loyal subjects. It's as if he is making a bid to be recognized as a sachem. And perhaps he actually does have a claim by his descent to that role, because he later does make the claim that his father was a sachem and that he himself is a sachem. Not always accepted by his relatives, but it's a claim that he does make.
Was Wampus successful in making the claim that he was and should be considered a sachem? Because it does sound like this is the latter part of his life and he's in a really complicated position. I mean, for a long time, he clearly identified with English law and customs and supported that system. And it's only now towards the end of his life that he's really trying to identify with the Native American world. So was he accepted as a sachem?
Yes. It seems like he's accepted by some Nipmuc people, the kind of younger class. During this time period, he's hanging around with people like Andrew Pittamy, a man whose wife and children had been killed by English during King Philip's War and who's very upset by it. So kind of the younger men who feel aggrieved seem to be friends with and somewhat supportive of John Wompas. The older people, like his uncles and some of the elders among the Nipmucs, are not supportive. They see him as self-interested and destructive, and they don't recognize him as a sachem. So perhaps there are some, again, who would accept him in that role. In terms of whether he's successful in claiming that, on deeds where he claims that he's a sachem, and that's a way of saying, I have the right to sell this land. Previously, of course, his kin had said, that's an illegitimate deed. He's not a sachem. He shouldn't be able to do that. But over time, particularly as some of the older people begin to die, the English hold on to that claim. They always like to be able to base their purchase of native land on native title. And so they're very happy to accept John Wampus's claim because it legitimates their own claim to land that they may have purchased from him.
So, Jenny, what do you think the larger lesson is from John Wampus's life? And how do you think it helps us better understand early America?
I think that John Wampus's life provides a really great window into this really critical time of transition. This is a time when native power is diminishing significantly as a result of a really devastating war. It's also a time when English power is under attack. I mentioned earlier these agents that are commanded to come to the crown and basically explain why they have been violating English law. Eventually, that results in Massachusetts' charter being revoked and a new royal government taking over in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts itself is going through this political transition from a local charter government to a royally supervised government, much more tightly controlled by the crown, at the same time as the native population is diminishing. Well, of course, none of these people who are going through these changes knew that these changes were going to happen at the time. And John Wampus gives us an opportunity to see how the native people may have perceived these changes as and before they were happening. It's very clear from his actions that he feels like the crown is going to support him, that the fact that the king had earlier in 1664 promised that native people were his subjects and that they could bring their grievances to him. He seems to be aware of that and claiming that right when he goes to petition to the crown. And it's great to be able to see that those are actions and promises that the natives took seriously and thought that they would be able to follow up on. Of course, in the long run, they were kind of hollow promises. The crown didn't really support the natives in the way that it had promised. But they didn't know that at the time. And so we can understand John Wampus making these threats and insults to the people in Cambridge because he seems to have felt like the crown had his back. It's also interesting to see the way that John Wampus was able to use his knowledge of both English and native culture in this time period, both to further his own interests and then later in his life to support the interests of his people. One of John Wampus's deeds in this time period, I think, is really significant, and that's his will. After he fails to get the right to sell land in Massachusetts, he actually returns to England and makes a second petition to the crown. He dies before he can collect the king's letter and return to New England. He dies in London. But before he dies, he writes out a will. And in the will, he gives land to some English people that he had met in England, but he also very explicitly gives the land at Hassanamisset, and that's the Nipmuc homeland, his own birthplace. He gives that land to the Nipmucs. And the fact that he's given land to both English and his Nipmuc kin in this will really ties the hands of his English heirs. Because if they want to collect on the land that he has promised them, they really have to acknowledge the right of the Nipmucs to Hassanamisset because it's in the same document. And in fact, that's what the courts do. For decades, English efforts to claim Hassanamisset get foiled because of this stipulation in John Wampus's will that says this is only for the Nipmuc people. And in fact, some of that land is still in the hands of the Nipmuc people today.
Wow. And this all really goes back to the very first point you made, which was that your aim was to show what was possible for Native Americans to accomplish in colonial British America. And that really happens to be a lot.
Yes.
Okay, now we should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the Massachusetts Bay Colony had lost its charter in the 1660s instead of in 1684? How might the lives and opportunities available to New England Indians, like John Wampus, have been different?
That is a really interesting question. When I think about that, I actually think that things might have been worse for Native people. The reason that I say that is that in the aftermath of the loss of the charter in 1684, a number of royally appointed officials came to Massachusetts who seemed to have very little regard for the rights of the Native people. They seemed much more interested in either lining their own pockets or asserting the prerogative of the king. So, for instance, Edmund Andros is governor of the Dominion of New England, and he refused to recognize Native rights to land. When English people would say, oh, I purchased this land from a Native person and therefore it's mine legally, he would answer and say that Native title did not even exist, that it was no better than a scratch of a bear's paw, he said, and that the only way that a legal title could be established was through the grant of the crown. Now, both Andros and a number of other royally appointed officials profited from a huge expansion in sales of native land during this time period. So I wonder if the charter had been revoked back in the 1660s and those royally appointed officials had come sooner, if that massive dispossession of native land might have taken place a few decades sooner. I'm actually kind of interested in a different counterfactual, and that is, what if the Massachusetts charter had stayed in place for much longer? I think it's possible that the Native people may have been better off, partly because without the royal government there, some of the colonial English people who had functioned as defenders of Indian rights by making sure that native land sales were restricted, or by assisting the natives in securing their own legal titles to land to defend them against dispossession. Those people may have had less power to do those actions under a royal government.
So, Jenny, what's next for you? What or who comes after John Wampus?
My new project is actually taking me kind of far afield. Most of my work has been in 17th century New England, but I've always wanted to do a project that's connected to my own history. And that is, my fourth great grandmother was a Shoshone Indian, a woman who married a French trapper and then had mixed race children. And that's a story that I've known since I was a little girl and have always been fascinated in that story. So my next project, I'm actually moving west and into the 19th century to look at the role of race and religion in the life of Sally Exervier Ward, that's my grandmother, and her family in the 19th century.
And if we have more questions about John Wampus and the 17th century Native American and English worlds, how can we contact you?
You can always reach me on my website, which is at the History Department at Brigham Young University. Send email there. I also have a regular Gmail address, and it's just jennypulsipher@gmail.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions by email.
Jenny Hale Pulsipher, thank you for joining us and for taking us through the very interesting life of John Wampus.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
It can be a challenge to view the history of early America through Native American perspectives. As Jenny related, so much of our historical record and what we've chosen to preserve over the years in our libraries, archives, account books, and diaries have been the records of the wealthy and powerful. And as Jenny just related, the English and American colonists of New England had greatly diminished the wealth and power of the Native Americans around them by the mid to late 17th century. When we create and maintain archives and libraries, we make a choice about the records we choose to preserve. And in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, Americans made decisions not to preserve a lot by the way of direct Native American voices. So as Jenny noted, it can be a real challenge to view the early American past through Native American eyes. And yet, Jenny has also demonstrated that there are many ways we can overcome these archival challenges to see both what was possible for Native Americans in early America and how they experienced and participated in the world as it changed. For example, in the life of John Wompas, we can see that some Native Americans chose to become Christians and live in Christian towns. That some, like Wompas, came of age and were educated in English societies. And we can also see the many ways in which Native Americans might use and manipulate English law and customs to their own advantage, just as we did in the many ways John Wampas secured and sold land, and in the way he sought protection from and an audience with the King of England. Then there's the pain and anger Native Americans must have felt as the world changed, and as English colonists, and at times Native men like Wompas, worked to dispossess them of their land, their wealth, and their power. In fact, Jenny related that John Wampas himself seemed to grow very angry at the English and the world around him as he embraced his Native identity towards the end of his life. This was the time where he decided to protect the Nipmuc people from further dispossession. And protect them he did. As we just heard, John Wampus' last will and testament has played and continues to play a really important role in securing ancestral Nipmuc land to Nipmuc people. Now, the life of John Wompas allows us to see that the world of 17th century North America wasn't completely European or completely native. It was a world where everyone needed to know something about the cultures and ways of other peoples, and how to navigate those cultures and ways so that they could handle different opportunities and circumstances as they arose. And it's precisely because the world of early America wasn't completely made up of one culture or one people that we need to do our best to get at and consider how that world looked and was experienced by as many of its different inhabitants as possible. If we don't, we'll miss some of the most interesting stories early America has for us, and we'll also never achieve a complete or even a good understanding of the early American past and all the different ways that past has informed our own present day. For more information about Jenny, her book, Swindler Sachem, and notes from our conversation, check out the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/235. KiwiCo makes learning enjoyable for all kids with strategized and accessible learning projects. And they're offering you a special offer just for being a Ben Franklin's World listener. Visit kiwico.com/bfworld to get your first crate free. That's kiwico.com/bfworld to get your first crate free. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you really enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what are some of the different voices that you found in your archival visits? I know you have your family trees, and I know you do archival research. So tell me about the different voices you've discovered. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute